Hey, this is Matthew and welcome back to Nerd News Today, and it's time for another Japanese wrestling figure review. Except today it's not a wrestling figure in the traditional sense, this is a Japanese MMA figure. Today we're looking at Tsuyoshi Kosaka, a name that a lot of newer MMA fans probably have no idea about. But when I first got into the sport, which was in the mid to late 90s, Tsuyoshi Kosaka was a big up-and-comer, and it wouldn't take long for him to become a pretty top name in the sport in Japan. And he remains there today, in fact, which, is pretty insane when you look at how long his career has been so far. So this is an actual Kara Pro figure, or Kara Pro figure, depending on how you want to say it. As far as I've been told, the correct way is Kara Pro, or Kara Pro, if you're going to say it a little more Japanese style. But, if there's anybody out there who knows for sure and wants to correct me, of course, feel free to. So this figure of TK is based on his appearance in Fighting Network rings. So there's a lot to break down here with the history of this figure and who this person is. So let's just start first with what Fighting Network rings is, which is also traditionally known as just plain old rings, if you want to just be quick about it. And rings started off as a pro wrestling organization, which was more in the style of kind of sort of shoot fights, but it wasn't shoot fights just yet. But a few years into their company's existence, they would transition completely into a full-on MMA organization. And that company is one of those organizations that people, again, don't really remember that well today. But at the time, it was huge, it was amazing. It had some of the best fights ever, in my opinion. And it had huge names, guys who would go on to compete in the UFC and Pride Fighting Championship and plenty of other places. And we're talking about guys like Frank Shamrock. We're talking about Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. We're talking about Gilbert Yvel. Maurice Smith spent a little bit of time in there. Ricardo Arona, and a few bigger names that I think most of you guys will remember. Jeremy Horn, Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, and Fedor Emelianenko, back when Fedor was just getting his feet wet in mixed martial arts. So rings was a pretty big deal, and believe it or not, my first exposure to rings was actually because of Tsuyoshi Kosaka. I had this random tape of Japanese MMA matches, wherever it was, like Best of J MMA at the time, and one of those matches I saw was Kiyoshi Tamura versus Tsuyoshi Kosaka. And that was a match that was also my first glance at Tamura, another guy who I love to this day. And the match that those two guys had is an absolutely amazing feat. I highly recommend you guys can watch the whole match if you can find it. It's going to definitely change the way you look at Japanese MMA. I think it's going to become one of your favorites too, especially if you are a pro wrestling fan who likes some good traditional chain wrestling and scientific wrestling, as a lot of us would call it. So as for this Tsuyoshi Kosaka figure, it's based on his rings appearance in around 99 because that's when this figure came out. And you can see on the front here, we got this nice picture of Kosaka, a young looking Kosaka, and it's really just honestly funny seeing him looking this young because I'm used to seeing him a few years later and a little bit more battle hardened. So look at this babyface TK over here, that's just adorable. We got his name in kind of bland Photoshop lettering up here. And his background for this picture is, it looks like some trees. I don't know what's going on here. It's like clouds and water and trees. And this is a bizarre background for an action figure, let alone a Japanese wrestling action figure. It's almost like they just found like a random background from a Miyazaki movie and just pasted it onto it. I don't understand the relevance to Tsuyoshi Kosaka at all, but it does make it stand out, at least. I'll say that much about it. The back of the figure has a bunch of his stats as well as a profile, and again, we can see that's from 99. By 99, he had already accomplished a lot and fought a lot of pretty big names. He had already fought Gilbert Yvel, Pedro Hizo. He had already fought Gilbert Yvel 3 times. He had already beaten Kimo Leopoldo. He had already had that match with Kiyoshi Tamura I mentioned, and the Frank Shamrock one, both of those in 97. He had fought and defeated Maurice Smith. He had his first match with Volkan. And he already had 3 appearances in the UFC. So he had done a lot already, but his stock wasn't even like as high as it would become, in fact. But we'll talk about that in a little moment or two. So yeah, let's go ahead and just take out this TK out of the box. It's a very yellowed package, and there's really not a lot to do about that. Yellowing, that just kind of happens. It's unavoidable. I'm just hoping that the figure itself is still doing all right. And here's our Tsuyoshi Kosaka out of the box. And I was a little skeptical of that head sculpt at first, but now that I'm seeing it out of the packaging, it does look like him. It's just very, very shiny for some reason. We looked at a lot of other figures and I've remarked about how shiny they tend to be. This one just looks, I don't know why, even more shiny, but that likeness is very much there. It's got the very good cheek structure, the very strong cheek structure and jawline that Tsuyoshi Kosaka has. It's also just kind of weird for me, again, seeing him looking younger. That might be what's throwing me off a little bit, but it definitely is Tsuyoshi Kosaka. So we got some schmutz on his back there, and I'm hoping that just comes off because I want to say that that's just paint from the cardboard on the back of the toy because it was in there for so long and just not maintained very well. So I'm going to deal with that off camera, but I'm pretty positive that's going to come off with some Goo Gone or Magic Eraser. But I've got to admit that that face, it does do it for me. That's Tsuyoshi Kosaka. I've got myself a Tsuyoshi Kosaka action figure. That's pretty great. This being a Kara Pro figure, the articulation is practically non-existent. You have shoulder joints that go up and down, and his waist moves. and it's pretty loose actually. Again, I think just because this figure was not maintained very well for however many years it was hanging out in that packaging. The upside about these is that you could pop these out and switch things into different gear. Same thing with the waist too. You could just pop that waist off and put another body on them because they're all essentially the same size. There's very little variation in size of them, and there's so many of them that have similarly thick bodies. You could fairly easily, I think, switch anybody onto him. TK here is wearing no shoes, but he's got kick pads on. So this would have been, again, fairly similar to what he would have wore in rings at the time. On the side of those kick pads, you can see he's got his name on each of them. So it's got basically all the marks that you need to hit for an MMA figure. You know, MMA figures, and especially pro wrestling figures based on Japanese guys at the time, were not really necessarily the most exciting or flamboyant. You know, we look at today's WWE Mattel figures and everybody's got some crazy entrance gear or some crazy pants with all sorts of designs, but at this point it was still very simple. It was usually just black trunks, and if you were in an organization that let you wear kick pads, you were wearing those. So everything is present and accounted for that needs to be here on the Tsuyoshi Kosaka figure. It's got an awesome likeness, it's got a very good looking body that's also pretty accurate to how his body was shaped. So for me, this is a pretty great TK figure. And you know, I don't think there is a lot of Tsuyoshi Kosaka merchandise out there. I don't think he ever had really any other figures, to be honest. I think this is actually his only figure, period. One of the only ways to get any merch of Tsuyoshi Kosaka outside of maybe a t-shirt or a poster or something. So this is pretty exciting for me to have this one here. So what else did Tsuyoshi Kosaka do that was notable? Well, it wouldn't be long after this toy came out that he had one of the biggest wins of his career, and that was a TKO against Fedor Emelianenko. Now, I'm sure most of you guys know who Fedor is, but if you don't know, Fedor was an MMA fighter that was pretty much the #1 guy for the longest time. He was undefeated for practically 10 years, and even at the point when TK had beaten him, he was already a pretty big up-and-comer, and his stock was rising very rapidly. But during the match, very, very early on, Fedor got cut. We're talking like seconds into the match. Fedor got cut. The doctor had to stop it because it was bleeding profusely, and that led to Fedor's first loss in MMA, but it would be his last loss for practically a decade. So, you know, keep in mind, this is when Fedor at that point became one of the most feared guys in mixed martial arts. And Fedor would have his revenge against Tsuyoshi Kosaka. They would meet many years later in a rematch at Pride Bushido 6 in 2005. And that time, yeah, Fedor pretty much dismantled him. He just mauled him. And yeah, it's a rough one to watch. But in terms of matches of TK after this figure came out, you know, he returned to UFC and had a match against Rico Rodriguez, which was a loss at UFC 37. He would battle Randy Couture again, defeated Ron Waterman. He had a pretty good match with Mario Sperry back at Pride 31. He lost to Mark Hunt back at Pride FC back in 2006 in a Pride event, which was, again, a really good time for Mark Hunt. That was actually Mark Hunt's kind of rise in the promotion, in fact. And he'd also fight James Thompson and Ryzen at one of their earliest events, and Mirko Cro Cop, which actually happened only a few years ago. In fact, Tsuyoshi Kosaka has actually been active even as far as January of this year. He fought in Heat 46. So he's still getting around. He's still competing, believe it or not. And again, this is a guy who started all the way back in '95 doing this, and he's still going today. That's an insanely long career to be competing in MMA. So I'm hoping that he doesn't turn into the Dan Severn of Japan, but I'm confident he's not going to go that far and that crazy. So my homework for you guys today is, if you're not familiar with Tsuyoshi Kosaka, check out his rings matches against Kiyoshi Tamura and Frank Shamrock. You're going to be amazed by those fights. And just to be a completionist, you should see the 2 matches with Fedor just to see them, because they're pretty important to both Fedor and Tsuyoshi Kosaka's career. If you can find it, you can check out Kosaka's match against Ron Waterman at Pancrase in 2004, which is when he won the Super Heavyweight Championship there, a belt that was basically won by Kosaka, vacated, and then it went bye-bye. And I'd also recommend his matches against Randy Couture and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, just because those 2 guys are like my favorites in MMA. But Tsuyoshi Kosaka had a reputation, and I think continues to have a reputation, of a guy who always brings it and is full of surprises. In companies like Pride FC and other places, you'd have a lot of Japanese fighters who'd come in and they'd be referred to by many Americans as tomato cans, guys who were there just kind of get beaten up, tossed around. Tsuyoshi Kosaka was one of those guys where you had to worry because he could take you out, he could stand toe-to-toe with you and not just survive, but be a serious threat and more than likely actually beat you. He's one of those guys that American fight fans really don't remember anymore, and he's done so much for the sport. I mean, he's a guy that basically more or less invented the butterfly guard in a roundabout way, or really kind of began to popularize it in MMA before it was a big thing. So Tsuyoshi Kosaka has contributed a lot to the sport of mixed martial arts, and I'm really excited and honored that I've got myself a figure of this man, who, by the way, I actually met when I went to Japan. I was backstage at, I think it was a Sengoku event, doing photography, and he was hanging out in catering, so I got to say hi to him. Speaks perfect English, by the way, so awesome guy. Love you, Tsuyoshi Kosaka. So that's our review of TK from the Kara Pro line, based on his appearance in Fighting Network Rings from 1999. And if you don't know who he is, now you do. So for me, it's worth hunting down, and I think it's going to be pretty great for you also. I hope you found today's video informative and entertaining as much as possible. And if you like it, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel, stick around and see everything else we do here. And hey, give us a thumbs up also. So until next time, I'm Matthew from Nerd News Today, and keep that fighting spirit burning.